So Scott and I are here today from the Ontario Renal Network to talk to you about our multi-care kidney clinic best practices. So I'm going to slide over here. So our objectives today really are to talk to you and provide some background information on the development of these, what we call multi-care kidney clinics or MCKC best practices in Ontario. We're going to walk through some of the key components of the best practice document, and we're going to share with you some of the next steps and hopefully, as Monica mentioned, have some time for some questions. Okay, so provincially, all the work that we do is in alignment with the Ontario Renal Network's Ontario Renal Plan. The ORN has identified integration of patient care throughout the kidney care journey as a key goal of the second Ontario Renal Plan, which we call ORP2. By 2019, the ORN has set out to ensure patients with chronic kidney disease transitioning from primary care to nephrology will have timely access to specialized care, including multidisciplinary care. The CKD care portfolio led by Scott and the team at the ORN has been tasked with ensuring that this aim is achieved by 2019. So here you'll see a timeline which outlines the evolution of our multi-care kidney clinics. In Ontario, renal care is considered a quality-based procedure and is funded as such. Multi-care kidney clinics funding is comprised of a bundled payment. Prior to 2015, the focus of these clinics was on pre-dialysis preparation, but didn't really focus on the whole person or other treatment options such as conservative care. With the launch of the second Ontario Renal Plan in 2015, there was a significant shift in the priorities looking to address the fact that multi-care kidney clinics had no clinical guidelines or best practices to define the quality of care being carried out within them. You'll see that in 2016, the ORN implemented a new funding strategy that looked at new and revised criteria for multi-care kidney clinic eligibility. It also provided programs with quarterly scorecards that looked at indicators such as how much time patients were spending in multi-care kidney clinics prior to starting on dialysis, and also looked at deferred dialysis rate data. Prior to 2017, all of the multi-care kidney clinics, which we know now are called multi-care kidney clinics, previously were called a number of different things throughout the regional programs. Some areas referred to their clinics as kidney care clinics or pre-dialysis clinics, pre-renal insufficiency clinics. So our Ontario-led Provincial Patient and Family Advisory Council really took the lead at trying to standardize a name and approach to these clinics, and we did come up with this name of multi-care kidney clinic at this time. And in 2018, in October, you'll see that the best practice document was released. So the release of this best practice document represents the culmination of 2 years of work that began in October of 2016 by the ORN with a current state assessment of all clinics throughout Ontario. The ORN team conducted program interviews and a number of site visits, which revealed that there was a significant variation in how MCKCs across the province were operating. The variation came in the form of time patients were spending in clinics, which could represent at the time 20 minutes up to several hours at a time, as well as the number of multidisciplinary team members that the patients were seeing. It was quickly identified that there was opportunity to standardize a minimum level of care across the province to ensure positive outcomes and experiences for patients. Feedback from regional programs staff in multi-care kidney clinics also indicated a need for best practices based on available evidence and experience. So as mentioned in the previous slide, the ORN conducted a current state analysis of all multi-care kidney clinics in Ontario. They completed an intensive lit review and then convened a multidisciplinary task group, which included patients and various healthcare providers like nephrologists, administration, social work, nursing, pharmacy, and dietitians to help in the creation of the document that would clearly define the best practices for high quality care in multi-care kidney clinics. The best practice document outlines the clinical best practices for the regional renal programs which they should have in place to ensure that several key functions are carried out within the multi-care kidney clinics. Scott is going to walk you through some of these functions in some of the upcoming slides. So why are multi-care kidney clinics important? So most of you on the line will know that the transition for a patient in multi-care kidney clinics into multi-care kidney clinics is very stressful and complex. They have many crucial decisions that need to be made about their future, and often patients are distressed and at high risk of clinically important complications that require a multidisciplinary team to support them. The ORN takes a person-centered approach to all of its work, which means that patients using health services are seen as equal partners in planning, developing, and monitoring their care. As such, multi-care kidney clinics are specialized, multidisciplinary clinics rooted in providing person-centered and culturally safe care. When we talk about culturally safe care, we mean that the care is delivered in the patient's preferred language, incorporates their cultural traditions and faith, and respects health beliefs and incorporates their traditional medicines where necessary. Okay, Scott is going to walk you through now some of the key components of the document. Scott? Did we lose Scott?
Can you hear me?
We can.
Excellent. So I'm going to just very briefly just give you a high-level executive summary and then kind of dive into some of the more specific components. So, and again, there'll be an opportunity to share the completed document. The final version will be done in January, I believe. So the core elements, again, as Stephanie already highlighted, that the approach in these clinics, and I think nobody would disagree with this, is that it's a person-centered approach. And again, these clinics are specialized. We've used the term sort of multidisciplinary. We've been taken to task by at least one individual to suggest perhaps interprofessional clinic may be a better term. And again, rooted in a culturally safe and person-centered care. So some of the key functions, again, recognizing once again, as you see, what kind of keeps coming up, the issues of ensuring that the patients are at the center and integral partners in their care. This includes aspects such as shared decision-making and having person-centered decision-making conversations. It's important, of course, that this be a source of learning for the patient, so receiving education, not just on the disease, but kidney health, treatment options that are available to them at the appropriate time. And of course, we're always doing the sort of nuts and bolts from certainly a physician perspective of managing the chronic kidney disease, the complications, blood pressure, metabolic complications. And again, just ensuring that patients are involved and have the help as they need to kind of navigate on their journey. And in the past in Ontario, and again, I'm not sure how it works in all the other jurisdictions, we sort of had a stipulation that at least 3 individuals see the patient. That might be a physician, a nurse, and at least one other interhealth professional. But in this document, we've called out more specifically a nurse, a nephrologist, a pharmacist, a dietitian, and a social worker. And interestingly, we've included the patient in the care team as well. Next slide. Again, there wasn't much in terms of criteria before about frequency of visits. I think we've talked before about the fact that we've targeted patients who are at higher risk of progression, which is defined as a 2-year risk of ESRD of at least 10% or an eGFR less than 15. Certainly some patients who don't meet those criteria also participate in these clinics, but from a funding perspective for the QBP, that's the criteria. And we've highlighted, and I'll go through it a bit more about what will happen in some of those visits, including the initial visit and orientation. And again, as a minimum, we've highlighted that patients should be seen at least twice a year, recognizing that as patients get more advanced, more frequent visits are almost certainly going to be required. And we've also highlighted that a nurse and a nephrologist should see the patient at each clinic visit. And again, as a minimum, the pharmacist, dietitian, and social worker should see the patient at least annually. And in the document, there's more details about particular times when additional visits would likely be required. Slide. The goals of care. So we've highlighted this. We think it's important that the patients obviously be engaged in these clinics and that we understand what their wishes, goals, preferences are. And we've called out specifically that goals of care conversation should take place within the first 3 visits to the clinic or within 1 year of entering the clinic, whichever comes first. With respect to education, we're trying to remind people that it's important that you recognize where the patient is at in terms of health literacy, to try to support them in their self-management. and always provide a culturally safe atmosphere, whether it's for the, the usual sort of clinic visits or education sessions. And again, always using this shared decision approach. And we specifically try to identify time when we think education is particularly critical to provide as it relates to treatment options, whether it be dialysis, preemptive transplant, or conservative care. And we've identified a 2-year kidney failure risk of between 20 and 40%. I'll go into a bit more about that. Next slide. And again, I think everybody on the call will know what's involved in terms of active management, whether it be managing their metabolic complications, anemia, managing medications. We often see patients coming in on new medications prescribed by other practitioners that may need dose adjustment or avoidance, working with them on their nutrition and diet, and providing support for their, and really delving into their symptoms and providing hopefully some solutions to those symptoms and referral to other services where appropriate. Next slide. And then again, just an important piece to the coordination, and I'll come to this again, but we want to ensure that, that we're in communication. So for example, if a patient's transitioning to peritoneal dialysis, that the peritoneal dialysis team are aware of this patient, that they've been involved prior to that transfer, and then defining specific transfer of accountability points. Next slide. So this slide here is really graphically tries to highlight what's happening in these clinics. It's representing that patient journey from that initial referral to the clinic, typically from a nephrologist who's been seeing that patient in a general nephrology clinic, through the initial orientation, highlighting a number of the key things that are happening at particular trigger points, all the way to a specific treatment decision being made, and ultimately going on to that next phase in their journey. On the right, you can see that throughout this journey, education is being provided to the patients and their families, and that we're actively managing their chronic kidney disease and hopefully their symptoms, and working with them on self-management strategies. And encompassing all this graphically, you can see that, again, shared decision-making, cultural safety, and person-centered care are an integral part to this and kind of encompass the whole process. Next slide. So hopefully you noticed there were some letters on some of those steps, so I'm just going to walk through some of those steps in the clinic. So again, I've highlighted for the population and the referral that 10% 2-year risk or an eGFR less than 15. In that initial visit, and again, as Stephanie highlighted, this can be, I'm sure many of you have experienced this, that for many patients that transition can be scary. It's an acknowledgement that this is a serious illness, and we try to kind of we recommend easing the patients into this a little bit. So you want to provide an orientation for them at that initial visit, highlighting what our goals and the philosophy are in the clinic, what are the services that will be provided, who the team members are and what their roles are, and how the clinic actually functions. I think that's an important kind of introduction to the clinic, and it's obviously important that we hear from the patient, and so that speaks to the notion of an integrated assessment being incorporated into that visit. Next slide. Again, the frequency of visits, so we've thought about this a lot. The initial funding guide was for 6 visits a year, but we were finding that, in fact, the average number of visits was quite a bit less than that. And obviously, patients earlier on in their disease may not need to attend the clinic as often as somebody later on, but we did think as a minimum that the patient should be assessed at least twice a year. I know from my own patients, I just did a MCKC clinic yesterday, and some of those patients we're seeing every 4 to 6 weeks as they get with more advanced kidney disease with more complications. We also recognize, and again, Stephanie highlighted, depending on who you talk to, Some patients are being seen in these clinics in 30 minutes, others are taking 2.5 to 3 hours. And this obviously at the far end is very tiring for patients. And although we have, at least 5 interhealth professionals in these clinics, less exceptional circumstances, we recommend that not everybody see the patient every visit and use a bit more of a targeted approach based on patient need or based on lab results or where they are in their journey. So ideally not more than 4 team members seeing that patient for an individual visit. And certainly in many provinces in Ontario, including Ontario, many provinces in Canada, including Ontario, Stephanie works in Sudbury. Many patients live far from the clinic, so we did want to kind of specifically call out that in-person visits are not always required, and there are other solutions, including telehealth strategies to provide more remote care to reduce the need for in-person visits when travel is far. Next slide. So again, I talked a little bit about the care team and the responsibilities, and the document goes into much more detail. And I should highlight that these sections were written by each of the team members that are called out here. So it wasn't Scott Brimble, nephrologist, writing the section for what the social worker does or what the dietitian does. We obviously incorporated the feedback and thoughts of those individual team members. We really just wanted to provide some clarity because I think a lot of uncertainty about this, a lot of overlap in roles. So we wanted to really highlight the key roles of each of those disciplines. And again, acknowledging that peer support, including the service provided from the Kidney Foundation, is an important component that can support the team, usually outside of the actual clinic visit, but be an additional resource to access. Next slide. That's not good. Can everybody else see the slides still? Because I'm not seeing them.
Selena, do you know if the slide is still visible?
Sorry?
Can you see it, Scott?
No, I can't. I'll just switch to my computer then.
I can see the slides here in Halifax. Is Penny Poya.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so I'll just work off my computer then. It's saying it's trying to connect on my end. So the next slide, at least I'm looking at my laptop here, is focusing on education. And again, I've highlighted some of this in the executive summary, but the 3 sort of key components that we wanted to highlight is, in addition to cultural safety, is to really acknowledge the principles of adult learning. I know personally for a fact that I'm not as quick at the uptake as my kids. When they ask me to help them with their homework, they quickly realize how useless I am. So I think, it's important to kind of acknowledge that often adults do better with sort of small bits, repetitive message. And so we need to acknowledge that. Patients are always asking us what can they do to help their circumstances. So helping them to develop those self-management skills is always key. And then again, our patients have different levels of health literacy. So it's important to try to get a sense of that when you're with your patient, and from that perspective, pitch the information accordingly. And then again, the key components of the educational components relates to kidney health and disease, particularly early on in their time in the MCKC or CKD clinics, providing peer support resources, and again, at later stages, really kind of focusing in on the treatment options. So the next slide. So the goals of care conversation, these conversations again are really focused on ensuring that the patients and the providers really have that shared understanding of what the patient's values wishes, preferences, and goals are for their care. And again, really, it's difficult to know how one could have a really comprehensive and complicated conversation about treatment options if you don't have a sense of their overall goals of care. So that's why, again, we've highlighted that that needs to take place earlier on in the patient's journey and not waiting until you actually are going to be looking at the treatment options for them. And again, on the next slide, looking at education on treatment options. Again, we're highlighting that treatment education should be using a shared decision approach, and there are a number of different tools that are out there available for people to use if they feel that that's helpful. Again, patient circumstances, their health, their social situation could change, so periodically revisiting their goals of care is an important component as well. And then we've really tried, and I think other provinces, BC in particular, have done a much better job than we have in Ontario with regards to preemptive transplant. So there's been a bit of a focus or emphasis in this document to sort of develop strategies or pathways to ensure that patients who have potential donors and therefore potentially a path to preemptive transplant, that we identify that a bit earlier and so to speak, get the ball rolling on that front. But acknowledging that that doesn't always work out as planned, so having a backup treatment option is recommended in this document. On the next slide, we're looking at the timing of treatment, and we looked at this for quite some time. There was a desire to move away from strictly an eGFR sort of threshold for when a patient should receive more detailed education about treatment options. But really, at the end of the day, it's very difficult to pin down a precise time. We did a number of different analyses looking at provincial data, and really a kidney failure risk window between 20 and 40% seems to be the best place to land. Really, there's no difference in that range, so I think you have to individualize this a bit, and so we've left it a pretty broad range so that you can individualize based on your program, and most importantly, based on that patient and where they are. Our colleagues in terms of transplant in Ontario have asked that patients who have a donor be referred when their kidney failure risk is 25%. So with that in mind, we've specifically suggested for patients who do have a potential donor or you think that is likely that you're going to need to do that treatment option education probably at the lower end of that 20 to 40% range in order to comply with the recommendations for referral for transplant, at least in Ontario. On the next slide, again, you've seen this already in the executive summary. This is looking at what active management of chronic kidney disease actually employs. We do still think we still hope that we're doing some good in terms of delaying progression, although much of sort of what is likely to impact that has already been put into place prior to arrival at MCKC, but nonetheless reviewing medications, blood pressure, making sure that we're doing everything we can to minimize the rate of progression and also minimizing the risk of cardiovascular complications, and then focusing again on anemia, bone mineral metabolism, diet, nutrition, and again, symptoms and quality of life. And as part of the Ontario Renal Plan 3 in Ontario, which is coming up next year, we've really kind of called out mental health as being an important focus for the Ontario Renal Network in the next few years. So we want to ensure that in this document we've highlighted that those who are struggling with mental health or psychosocial health issues, that we are linked in closely with the appropriate experts to help with that. And again, just highlighting the importance of supporting and helping them to develop self-management skills. Next slide. Again, the coordination and navigation of care. So we're not working in a silo when we're in these multidisciplinary clinics. So we're communicating, of course, with the family doctor and other providers for that patient. And then as the patient advances on with respect to their kidney disease, once they've made that decision, once it's time to actually act upon that decision, we want to be in close communication with the appropriate clinic, whether it's PD or transplant, et cetera, and then ensuring that at the appropriate time the patient's care is transferred, and we just highlighted the obvious time points where that would take place. And then there's, again, in Ontario, and I'm sure in other jurisdictions, been a real focus on ensuring that we're providing good support for these patients who do choose conservative care. We specifically in Ontario call this Comprehensive Conservative Renal Care, or CCRC is the acronym. And again, making sure that we have the necessary skills and knowledge to continue to take care of the patients who choose that pathway in the clinic, but also tapping into community resources and supports where appropriate. Moving on to the next slide, looking at some of the indicators. So this is something that's a little bit in its infancy, but we wanted to sort of associate with this best practice document some of the quality indicators that we think need to be highlighted. It would be associated with this best practices work. So in Ontario, what are we doing right now? So here's a few on this slide. So we're wanting to ensure that patients who are actually eligible and appropriate for these clinics are actually having access to them. So we're looking at it on a provincial and a program level, that patients who are known to a nephrologist, looking at what proportion of those patients who are eligible are actually being referred to the clinics, and we're sort of monitoring that over time. We also want to ensure that patients who are referred to those clinics actually have a reasonable amount of time in that clinic to access the resources to be appropriately receive the education and support they need. So we've called that out as it being at least 12 months. So we're looking at the proportion of patients who start dialysis or get a transplant who are followed in the clinic for at least 12 months. And again, we're monitoring that provincially, but on a program level as well. And then a third initiative that's been a really important one, I think everywhere in Ontario we've focused on this, is looking to ensure that we're aligning with CSN recommendations that patients with advanced CKD, that dialysis is deferred until they've developed symptoms or complications that we feel truly are going to improve with initiation of dialysis. And we have a specific metric of looking at the proportion of patients who start dialysis with an eGFR less than 9.5 and have a provincial target of at least 75% of patients. And we're not there yet, but we have seen steady improvements in this, not only in Ontario, but this has been seen really since the IDEAL trial. I think we're seeing this more and more. On the next slide, a few other indicators. We do think that these clinics are an important part of ensuring that patients feel that they are able to do dialysis at home. So we are looking at incident and prevalent home dialysis rates, again, provincially and again by program. We're going to start rolling out the requirement that a goals of care conversation be documented within 1 year of the clinic being attended. So that's going to be coming in the near future. And then there's, through some work of other portfolios at the Ontario Renal Network, there's been a suite of patient-reported outcomes and patient-reported experience that have been developed, obviously in closely aligned with, I think, Alberta and BC, working from what work they've already done. So those are coming as well. So I'm going to wrap up there and hopefully leave some time for questions, comments, and your thoughts. I do want to just specifically thank the whole task group that worked on this, including Stephanie. Again, it was a labor of love. I do want to specifically call out Monica's team in BC. I mean, we'll be upfront. We started with the BC best practices document as a framework to work with, and so we've acknowledged that heavily in the document. And while we didn't plagiarize it, perhaps we certainly heavily used the document to help us to develop ours in Ontario. In terms of what's coming next, we've been getting feedback in Ontario from the different programs. We've run webinars similar to this today and have incorporated feedback, and then we're going to collate all that and where we think appropriate and where there's sort of a recurring message or theme, adapt the document based on that, and then the final document will be released in January and of course will be available to everyone. So maybe I'll stop there and hand it back to, I guess, Monica.
Sure. Thank you so much, Scott and Stephanie, for that excellent overview. I know from experience that each bullet point you mentioned, that once they're out there, sound pretty self-explanatory, but each bullet point takes weeks of dialogue and input and compromise and trying to move forward. So thank you. I think I'd like to start, if we can, with any initial comments or questions to Scott or Stephanie, or I think you put your hand button on the side of your on the right side of your computer.
I have a
go ahead.
Yeah, sorry, I have a question. This is Penny Poir from Nova Scotia. Thanks very much, Scott. That was very interesting. And it seems that a lot of places across Canada are sort of thinking about the same thing. So it was interesting for us here. I'm just curious, a couple of things for the MCKC clinics. You mentioned that they're referred from the patients in that clinic are referred from the general nephrology clinic. I'm wondering, would the same primary nephrologist carry through that patient's care as they enter into the MCKC clinic, or is the care transferred to a different group of nephrologists? No?
I can answer that. So the short answer is it depends. So I know, for example, in my own program, we tend to continue following our patients along when they transition to that clinic. I know other programs have, essentially what we would call CKD experts who, I think Ottawa is an example where they may have 3 or 4 nephrologists who are the only ones in that clinic. So I think there's different models. I wouldn't say any one is right or wrong. I think my own view is it's a bit of a scary time. So having the same nephrologist might be reduce the anxiety a little bit.
And the follow-up question to that is, how does the funding, because this is a funded enrollment clinic, so how does the funding work? If the patient is seen more frequently, is it based on frequency of visits, or do you get one package for the patient for the duration that they're followed in that clinic?
Yeah, so I'm not the funding guy, but my understanding is basically the programs are funded in sort of 6-month blocks. So there's sort of an annualized amount of money that will go for a patient, that follows the patient. And if you have one visit, at least one visit in that 6-month period, you get half the funding. That sort of discussion had preceded the best practices. We didn't want to sort of, incentivize might not be the right word, but maybe to be having patients brought to the clinic, perhaps in some situations, more frequent than might be necessary. We didn't want to sort of say, you have to see the patient 6 times a year. We didn't want to just say, which was the old way, is, just tell us if the patient shows up or not and you'll get your money. We didn't want to kind of go that way either. So we kind of said, what is a bare minimum, once in 6 months and you'll get the funding for that 6-month period. If they come once or 25 times in that 6 months, it's the same funding. But separate from that, we also are monitoring sort of average annualized patient visits per year and sharing that information with the program. So, and we are seeing it's fairly uniform, and on average, it's typically around 4 visits per year. And again, some programs might be twice a year earlier on in their disease, and might be as much as 12 times a year at the very end. So it varies, but the funding is you get all 6 months of money for having one eligible visit in that 6-month period.
And BC is the same. It's blended based on GFR buckets, and every time we look back, it all averages out. They have to have had a visit documented in the year, but otherwise, it's based on a blended rate. What we're looking at now is whether we should be changing that rate a bit for people who are followed on a conservative care pathway, because we know they do sometimes taking care of those patients is as hard or harder sometimes than patients on chronic dialysis. So we're looking at it again, but it is blended. I think we have a group chat question by from Dr. Bello in Edmonton, I think. Scott, can you see the group chat questions, or do you want them to be read out?
So I can't see anything. The modem in this clinic died, so I can't see anything now.
You can't see anything? Okay. Dr. Bello, do you have a speaker? Would you like me to read it out? I will read it out. The question was around the enrollment at less than 15 mils per minute and querying whether that is late for optimal preparation. And then a follow-up question was whether you plan to integrate primary care in your CCRCs.
Sorry, I'm just at the same time getting some technical backup support. So in response to the first question about the eGFR less than 15, that was sort of a little bit of a safety net. So we think that the 2-year 10% risk is going to capture the vast majority of patients, acknowledging that there might be patients, with very low levels of proteinuria who may be very elderly and therefore could have an eGFR quite low, but not make that 10% eligibility criteria. When we actually looked at the provincial data, there was actually very few patients that were being missed by the 10% 2-year rule. We've also spent a lot of time over the last, I think, 3 years now. In fact, we just looked at the 2-year data to see, as a result of the change from an eGFR less than 30 to the current criteria, whether there were patients that were no longer eligible who were ultimately going on to dialysis anyway. And the number has been remarkably low. So although it sounds very low, eGFR less than 15, that's not the primary criteria for these clinics. It was really the 2-year 10% risk. And, for every sort of question or comment about that end, there have been others saying, why 10% 2-year? Why not higher? That's still very low. So, I think we've got it about right. But the important thing is we have been continuing to monitor and watching for any unintended consequences, and so far so good, and we're 3 years out now. Sorry, was there a second question I've forgotten?
The second question was around integrating primary care in your CCRCs, your conservative care pathway clinics, and if there's any plan to do that.
Yeah, I'll give Stephanie an opportunity to speak as well. I would say no, not sort of integrated specifically, but we are definitely acknowledging that often in some communities there may be very good primary care or actual, often the palliative teams in the community are primary care teams. And so, for example, where I am right now in Brantford, there's an excellent team. So we'll often get them involved. And one of the things we're looking at in our own program, not a provincial thing, but our own program, is actually once the patient chooses that path, we actually connect them to their local hospice just to sort of put them on that team's radar. Again, at least locally, the hospices are connected to those community-based teams, whether it's primary care or otherwise. So that's an approach we've been taking. I think there's a whole CCRC team or portfolio that I'm not involved with, so we're going to be really ultimately guided by them in terms of how they want us to proceed in this area, and they wrote most of the section as it relates to conservative care for this document. I don't know, Stephanie, did you have any other thoughts? And then I'd also be curious what BC is doing.
No, I think from an ORN perspective, we really looked at primary care in terms of how primary care accesses kidney services. So making sure that referrals to probably comes at the appropriate time. I do think with the third Ontario Renal Plan and some of the work that's happening with palliative care and conservative management, that there'll be probably much more of a focus on primary care integration to that pathway for patients. So I think it's work that's starting and will be well underway with our next renal plan. But as Scott mentioned, some programs are probably a little bit further ahead than some when it comes to palliative care and primary care.
And I would say BC is similar. It's the linkages that have been developed and the pathways, and not yet incorporating other practitioners, be it nurse practitioners or GPs in the clinics. But some programs have independently started doing that, so we'll learn from that and hopefully build at a national level.
Scott, it's Braden. Scott and Stephanie, quick question. Great, you can hear me. Well, thank you for presenting this. This is exactly what I had hoped when we got together with webinars, that there would be this many people online from across the country and that the information would be as relevant. Like this what you presented is extremely relevant for Alberta, and I suspect the other provinces. You highlighted a couple of things that I just wanted to have a follow-up question on. We've heard from patients that transition time when they start dialysis is exceedingly scary and that they wish they had a lot more information. And I'm wondering if you're developing any resources for that, because again, I see this network as potentially sharing resources. And then you also talked about the advantage of this being a multidisciplinary clinic. And is some of the resources, are you hoping that that's used to engage additional allied health, even like psychologists or social workers, to do some group education around supporting behavior change and supporting self-management, like smoking cessation or healthier lifestyle, those types of things? Like we see a lot of obesity that's very complex to change and support patient behaviors there. So are you thinking about group type education classes, or is some of the funding for that?
Yeah, thanks, Braden. So there's quite a bit there. In terms of sort of the materials for patients, I think there's a number of important points. Like you say, it's sort of that transitioning out. The clinic is a stressful time coming into the clinic at different decision points. And so the plan, the next body of work for the portfolio I'm involved with is to really start working on the materials that would be either for the provider to use as a resource when providing that education, or patient-facing materials as well. And phase one of that would be, of course, just sort of a bit of a, casting it out and seeing what's already out there and not reinventing the wheel, and that would be within Ontario and outside. And then I think ultimately the idea would be just to share that with the programs in the province. And I would love for this network, I think that's something I had said early on with this network, that would be a great opportunity is to do something on a more national level, because it seems like every program is kind of doing their own thing. I know at my own program, we've developed some things. I don't know who did them. I don't know what the process was. I don't know if they work or that they're good. I have no idea. So I think that's a really important part, and certainly transitioning to dialysis is another important point, or another important transition time. Sorry, I've forgotten what else you asked, Braden.
Braden, I think you asked about funding for education clinics. So the bundled
group education.
Yeah, the bundled payment that we do receive for the multi-care kidney patients does not include education. So there's a separate funding stream for education, so that whether that be one-on-one education sessions or to do those group type sessions. So there are options to programs to choose if they prefer a one-on-one approach or that group approach. And I know there is some variation within the province in terms of what's happening from that perspective. And then I think you asked about using the funding or the opportunity to look at having more sort of mental health streams or psychology streams or psychologist streams. And I think that's probably something that we'll be looking at in the future with the development of the third Ontario Renal Plan. And again, Scott mentioned the focus on mental health and how we can integrate some of those services and ensure that patients have access to service, whether that be incorporating some of those disciplines within the clinics themselves or actually looking to make sure that the referral pathways to external providers is a little bit more clear and defined and accessible for patients.
And just to follow up on that, I mean, it's a great point, Braden. And, you know, in our own program, we've sort of just started a pilot of having a clinical psychologist all to our own. In order to fund that, we've kind of been a little bit sneaky. Hopefully nobody from the ORN's on the call. You know, where we can fund home visits. So any visit that's going to the patient's home, either because they're already on a home therapy or to help support them towards doing a home therapy, those home visits are funded, and I guess must be funded well enough that we can fund a clinical psychologist. And, you know, in just 1 month, I think I've probably myself made about 10 referrals. The patients are raving about him, and I would love to be able to see that kind of role ultimately rolled into these clinics. Just as, you know, it's one thing to say it's a priority, mental health, but it's another thing to actually do something about it. And I don't know how it is in Alberta, but in Ontario, it's a real dog's breakfast, and there's a lot of work to be done on the mental health front, and this is just one cog in that wheel, or one wheel in that cog.
Got it. It's Monica. Maybe one just reflection and then a question. As a province that has been able to use a best practices document similar to yours for about 4 years, I think what the benefits hugely have been figuring out what everyone should be doing at what stage, where our eye on the ball should be, educating new staff so that when someone comes with a, you know, overzealous or misguided approach to something, we can kind of say, okay, no, this is where our focus is. It's also allowed us to branch out a bit with the other CKD clinic care that we should be providing as a province in a coordinated fashion. So our best practice document has allowed us to, you know, when we've established PKD clinics, inherited kidney disease clinics, GN clinics, conservative care pathways, transplant first, not to do that new, but to really do that in the same lens as CKD clinic care. And just a thought out there that from the document you've put out, are you thinking of incorporating some of the other CKD clinic care that's been established under the same lens as the program you've put here? Like, it'd be the same tenants, right?
Yeah, it's interesting you asked that. I mean, we've had those conversations. I think there is a little bit of a philosophical argument or debate about that. I know, say, just from a nursing perspective, you know, the knowledge and skill sets of taking care of a young woman with GN versus maybe an older patient with advanced kidney disease and diabetes might be a little bit different. But I think, you know, the overarching, you know, the concepts, the overarching sort of philosophy of how you provide multidisciplinary care is the same. So while we've kind of said we're not going to put, for example, GN or PKD or any of these other sort of specialized clinics sort of roll it into this specific document or roll it into this portfolio, we work closely with those groups and try to, you know, and in fact, I mean, this document, you know, when it came to different areas, whether it's GN, you know, we would go to that team and say, you know, can you help us to write this? And for GN specifically, it got complicated because there are patients who are, of course, should be followed in a GN clinic. They're on immunosuppression. They're quite complex, but they might also have advanced kidney disease and may need, you know, some preparation for potentially not responding to therapy. So kind of navigating how to take care of that patient when there's sort of two different places they could potentially reside in. And I think we're ultimately going to leave it to programs to kind of decide how that best works. But for now, we're not rolling those specialty clinics into this sort of CKD model or this best practices. But I think you're right. A lot of the different pieces are the same, and certainly the philosophy and overall goals, I think, are quite similar.
And then my other question is just a very practical one. So how do you document, calculate, and chart the 2-year KFRE in your clinics? Is that something? And then has there been an education given to patients about that? Because, you know, one is a high number versus a low number. If your KFRE is high, it's bad, versus a low GFR. And patients do, with all the other patient-facing materials, still are GFR linked. So have you started education campaigns on that, or are people reverting to GFR, or how have you been incorporating that with your patients?
Yeah, so again, locally, I can say I use it a lot, and I've personally found it's something a little bit more tangible for the patients, that it's something they tend to understand better than saying, you know, your GFR is 23. What does that mean? It always sounds terrible. And then I would usually kind of anchor it and say, well, you know, patients who start dialysis are maybe down less than 10 to give them some scale. But now to say, you know, your risk of needing dialysis or transplant in the next 2 years is X or Y, they find that quite helpful. I think it will be one of the, you know, to Braden's point earlier, that some of the patient-facing material, I think that is an area we want to look at. Most of our patients seem to come to clinic with their labs in tow already. So there are 2 main lab providers in Ontario, and we're in discussions with one of them to get the KFRE automatically printed out on the lab sheet, and we'll be providing sort of the wording for the patients as to the relevance of it, as well as for the primary care provider, whoever's ordering a test, what the significance of that is. Or, for example, if they're ordering an EGFR without an ACR, one of the messages on the lab report would say, if you do an ACR, then one can calculate risk and provide some links. So it's still a lot of work to be done. We haven't done much, to be perfectly honest. In terms of, to the initial question, we have this ORS system. I think it's similar to PROMIS, except, you know, we don't have my understanding is PROMIS is something they can actually work with in the clinic. We don't have that in Ontario, but the data reporting system, the programs have to basically provide the EGFR and ACR. We're still, you know, we've got some rules in place for how current labs have to be, and the idea would be to make it as simple as possible over time. So hopefully the ACR doesn't have to be done again and again and again indefinitely. So we're analyzing data to see whether we can get away from that.
Great, thank you. I see we're nearing the end and we'll be cut off. Can I, one last question from anyone on the line? So if anyone does have any questions, comments that you don't want to talk about here, feel free to maybe email through Selena, and we will have those questions answered by the presenters. I'd just like to thank everyone again for taking either your morning, noon, or lunch time with us, and we will be in touch for the next discussion in March, and hopefully some dialogue in between with respect to next steps. So thanks again to Stephanie and Scott.
Thanks everyone for joining.